So I got to level with you guys. I've done pretty well so far with all this quarantine business, but this week I am really distraught and upset that we can't be together to talk about Ralph Waldo Emerson. Without a doubt, he is probably one of my favorite writers, one of the most meaningful and most influential thinkers and writers of his day. And I absolutely love working with students through Ralph Waldo Emerson's essay, Self-Reliance, here in English 251. So I'm having a hard time having to relegate this to this video presentation, but I'm going to do my best. I hope that you watched the brief Emerson biography that I posted in our Blackboard course. It's a video I found on YouTube, and I wanted you to watch that first. It runs about 10 minutes, but it will provide a good context for the few slides that we have this morning, and certainly will help position you to respond to the discussion post that I'm going to have you all do this week in connection with self-reliance. Okay, so now you're wondering, what do milk duds have to do with the big E? So here's the deal. When I was a kid, I had a buddy of mine, Jeff Moore was his name. And when we'd go to the movies, he'd buy a big tub of popcorn and then he'd get a box of milk duds. And I can remember the first time I saw him do this, he took his milk duds and he poured them into the tub of buttered popcorn. And apart from being a poor nutritional choice, I had to remark to him when we were lads, what are you doing with these milk duds? He said, oh, well, when I'm watching a movie, I like to, be sitting there in my chair watching the movie, and I like to sort of throw popcorn into my mouth, over and over again as I'm watching the movie. And so I do that. He says, I take the popcorn, and sure enough, I just kind of throw it into my mouth, and it's popcorn, it's popcorn, it's popcorn. He said, but then every now and again, he said, what I reach down and grab and throw in my mouth is a milk dud. And when I hit a milk dud, it's like, wow, that tastes really good because it's chewy and it's sweet and it's different. It's substantively different than all this popcorn, the buttery, salty popcorn that I've been having. So Jeff Moore was kind of a weird guy. And so anyway, I tell students, look, you've got to keep this analogy when you're reading Emerson because Emerson, as a writer, you're going to be reading Self-Reliance, this seminal essay of his, and you're going to be reading along, and there are going to be a lot of sentences that you just don't understand. And you're going to read them, and you're going to be thinking, popcorn, 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 popcorn. What is this guy saying? I don't know. Popcorn, popcorn, popcorn. But listen up. You're going to hit a sentence that's just going to explode off the page. You're going to hit a sentence and you're going to go, wow, holy cow. Let me chew on that. I mean, this is a chewy, chocolatey, sweet nugget of knowledge and of insight. So this is what milk duds have to do with the big E. Okay. Trust me on this. Trust me. Just read it. Read through. Don't worry about understanding every little sentence that he's going to say or every allusion that he's going to make to history or to philosophy. It doesn't matter. Just keep reading. Read through the popcorn. And then you're going to hit a milk dud. And you're going to know a milk dud when you hit a milk dud. Okay? God, I wish we were in class. So without a doubt, Emerson really is the central figure in the Transcendentalist movement. As you know, Emerson was the son of a Unitarian minister who died when Emerson was 8. Emerson's grandfather, interestingly enough, was likewise a Unitarian minister. And Emerson's grandfather was actually present there in Concord, Massachusetts, when the Redcoats came into Lexington and to Concord, with the shot that was heard around the world, the beginning of the American Revolution. William Emerson was sitting there upstairs in the old manse, which is the Emerson home that is still there in Concord, Massachusetts. And William Emerson, this is Emerson's grandfather, would go on and be a chaplain in the American Revolutionary Army. He would ultimately fall ill at Ticonderoga, became fevered with illness, and passed away there. Emerson went to Harvard as a young boy at the age of 14, graduated in 1821, and then after studying theology, like his father and grandfather before him, was ordained as a Unitarian minister in 1829. He enjoyed for a time delivering sermons. However, Emerson's faith in Christianity began to waver as he came under the influence of German philosophers and the Romantic poets Samuel Taylor Coleridge and William Wordsworth. After he lost belief in the rites of the Last Supper and other holy sacraments, he resigned from his church in 1831. You see, he believed that so many in the congregation were simply going through the routines, the rituals and the rites of holy sacraments without truly feeling the spiritual intensity or the spiritual communion with the divine. And that, in part, is what he had issue with respect to organized religion, that it had become a institutionalized hierarchical practice, one that did not truly celebrate and encourage the individual's connection with the divine. And to Emerson, this was paramount. The love of his life, Ellen Tucker, a young, promising poet, died tragically from tuberculosis, leaving Emerson a financial legacy that allowed him to spend the rest of his life traveling, lecturing, and writing. And with the inheritance that he got from Ellen Tucker's estate, he jumps on a ship, he sails across the Atlantic, and he goes to Europe for 2 years, traveling, thinking, sort of trying to figure out who he was. And when he comes back to America 2 years later, Emerson truly recreates who he is and what his life's work will be. In 1836, he publishes Nature, a major contribution to American Romanticism and to Transcendentalism. It appeared anonymously first and was favorably received among his friends. Not until the publication of his essays in 1841 was Emerson confirmed as a dominant presence in American letters. To this day, his influence on American writers is undeniable. This is nothing more than a association and a compilation of images. Here in the center is a famous letter that he wrote to Walt Whitman in 1855 upon Walt Whitman's publication of Leaves of Grass. The pictures of the home here on the lower right, the two that sort of look like an old barn, those are pictures and images of the old manse. This is the Emerson ancestral home in Concord, Massachusetts. The Foursquare on the bottom right was the home that Emerson would later occupy, also in Concord, Massachusetts. Interesting footnote, Nathaniel Hawthorne and his wife Sophia rented the old manse and lived there for several years. And Hawthorne, in fact, wrote some very famous stories while he was living there and collected them in a collection of stories called Mosses from an Old Manse. So Emerson's essay, Nature in 1836, contains really the seed idea of what would be and continue to be Emerson's major ideas. The need for a new national American vision, the use of personal experience, and the notion of the cosmic oversoul, or that idea that we are all interconnected with one another as a result of each and every human being divine creatures themselves. He opens his essay, Our age is retrospective. It builds upon the sepulchres of the fathers. It writes biographies, histories, criticism. The foregoing generations beheld God and nature face to face, we through their eyes. Why should not we also enjoy an original relation to the universe? Why should not we have a poetry of insight, not of tradition, and a religion by revelation to us, and not the history of theirs? Embosomed for a season in nature, whose floods of life stream around and through us, and invite us by the powers they supply to action proportioned to nature, why should we grope among the dry bones of the past? The sun shines today also. There is more wool and flax in the fields. There are new lands, new men, new thoughts. Let us demand our own works and laws and worship. You sense in this passage, don't you, this optimism and this insistence on firsthand experience instead of dry deference to the past and to tradition, to dogma, to institutionalized knowledge. Emerson is saying we are alive and living today. So let us live today and let us experience and know ourselves and know nature and know God today. One of the most frequently cited passages in Emerson's essay, Nature, comes on page 1284 in our text. Crossing a bare common in snow puddles at twilight under a clouded sky, without having in my thoughts any occurrence of special good fortune, I have enjoyed a perfect exhilaration. I am glad to the brink of fear. In the woods, too, a man casts off his years as the snake his slough. I become a transparent eyeball. I am nothing. I see all. The currents of the universal being circulate through me. I am part or particle of God. So the metaphor of the transparent eyeball you can see uh, characterized in this sketch of Emerson walking through the woods. And you see he is just where his head is under his hat is just this gigantic eyeball. Um, a very often replicated sketch from the seminal work by Emerson's in 1836. It's truly a moment of pure bliss, almost a Zen-like peace that Emerson is trying to describe here, where his ego, his sense of self and identity vanishes, somehow merges with the external world, right? Where his ego disappears and he becomes one with the currents of the universe. Poets and mystics have always been drawn to these exquisite moments, these moments of extreme bliss, extreme peace, profound insight, profound connection. Wordsworth will talk about these. He'll call them spots of time. Later, T.S. Eliot in his poetry will try to describe in words these exquisite moments that we have in our lives. They're sweet and they're always fleeting, but in those moments, we see eternity. Even though we're not reading in entirety or even in part some of his essays, I feel obliged to mention the significance of his major essays, his major statements. 1 year after Nature is published, he presents in lecture form The American Scholar. The American Scholar was addressed before the Phi Beta Kappa Society of Harvard University in 1837. It was immediately received as influential and remains important as an idealistic appeal for active leadership, active scholarship, active genius in American society by American men and women. The scholar in the essay, defined by Emerson, is man thinking, and he should rely on the ancient precept, know thyself, and the modern precept, study nature. Each age, asserts Emerson, must write its own books, but the scholar must do more than think, and he must act. And this is important because there, sitting in the congregation, was a young graduate, a young man named Henry David Thoreau, who was sitting and listening to Ralph Waldo Emerson, a man, a philosopher, a writer who would become, for Henry David Thoreau, a very good and bosom friend, but also an extraordinarily important mentor. Knowing himself and his role, Emerson would say, the scholar must be self-reliant and free of the bondage of the popular cry, of conforming to society and its expectations of its individuals. This essay would be called Our Intellectual Declaration of Independence by Oliver Wendell Holmes, a name you should remember. Remember, Holmes was one of those fireside poets. But you see what Holmes is saying here is that, again, we had declared ourselves politically independent from England in 1776. But this, Holmes is saying, this statement, this essay, this pronouncement of Emerson's functions fully as an intellectual declaration of independence, that we no longer need to be slave and culturally dependent and privileged what previous English and European writers and thinkers believed, wrote, and held to be true. Again, you see the insistence on today. You see the insistence on American thought and American contributions. 1 year later, Emerson is asked by the graduating class of Harvard's Divinity School to give the commencement speech to this group of young men who had trained at Harvard to become Unitarian ministers. Emerson was getting a name for himself as a writer, as a lecturer, and so he accepts the invitation to come and deliver a commencement speech. It's interesting to note that there were only about 8 or 9 graduates in this small graduating class, but also in attendance, though, were the Harvard faculty and distinguished civic leaders of Boston and Cambridge. Um, Emerson had a religious sense of mission, right? We know that he had trained and he himself had functioned in the pulpit as a minister. Although many accused him of subverting Christianity, he would explain that for him, quote, to be a good minister, it was necessary to leave the church. It's a pretty profound statement, but it gives you insight into Emerson's sense of purpose, his sense of skepticism with the function and efficacy of the religious order of the day. And so he did. He delivers a highly unconventional speech to this group of graduating men. It was so provocative and so controversial that Harvard banned Emerson from speaking at Harvard for 30 years. So there's got to be something in there that's worth reading, right? So I encourage you, if you are someone who's interested in things like theology and religion, I encourage you to read through this essay. In it, Emerson accused the church of acting, quote, as if God were dead, and of emphasizing dogma while stifling the individual's spirit. Did I mention how much I wish we were actually in class together? Whew. It's a poor substitute, but it's all we have right now. The Poet, an essay published in 1841, also to be found in complete form in your textbook, is Emerson's treatise, in other words, his major statement on the function and the role of the poet. Now notice, this is poet with a capital P. In other words, a poet of substance, a poet of genius. Think here of people like Shakespeare, like Chaucer, like Milton. Italy had Dante. Think of the ancient Greeks and Romans, poets like Horace, poets like Ovid, etc. He distinguishes in the essay the poet from a simple versifier. Now, every poet we have read thus far, especially those that in that clustered group, the fireside or the schoolroom poets, Emerson would say are mere versifiers. They can write poetry. Sure they can. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow could, he could rhyme all day long. But in this essay, there's a famous sentence, or at least it's famous to me, because I always point students to it. In the sentence, he writes something of, and I've got to rely on my memory here, he writes, talent may frolic and juggle, semicolon, genius realizes and adds, end quote. And what he's saying here is Emerson saying, yeah, you can be a talented poet, and you can frolic and juggle and versify all you want. You can iambic pentameter until the cows come home, right? But that doesn't make you a poet with a capital P. Doesn't make you a Shakespeare. Doesn't make you a Milton or a Chaucer. So he says, for poetry is not just meters, but a meter-making argument. That's what makes a poem. In other words, again, because of those traditional and conventional poetic forms, Emerson believes that so many of poets are versifiers and they're prohibited and they're constrained by these traditional forms, making sure that the stanzas are all composed and crafted correctly with iambic or tetrameters and alternating rhyme schemes, or the sonnet, all these things that we've talked about. And when you become a slave to the tradition and the form, the thought, the inspiration, the idea of the poem, the genius of the argument that the poem should be making is always secondary. And Emerson's not having that. Also in the poet, Emerson will lament after he calls out for the need for a poet to sing, truly sing America's greatness, its wildness, its potentiality, its people, its places, its victories, its losses, its shame. he says, or he writes, I look in vain for the poet that I describe, right? In other words, and he'll even say, America has yet to create a, a genius, right? And and note this, he's lumping his own self in there as well. Emerson wrote poetry, not particularly good poetry. And I always, though, think about people like Longfellow and Holmes and Lowell and Bryant, people who were alive and writing poetry and considering themselves to be quite proficient at poetry. I always wonder what they must have felt like when this essay came out. You know, I wonder if they felt a little offended or maybe overlooked. I think they must have, don't you? But before we change slides here, you got to remember the poet that Emerson is calling for is alive. He is writing poetry. He's yet to come to the surface or to the fore. His name is Walt Whitman. If there's criticism of Emerson's philosophy or his system of thought uh, being unstructured or not consistent, that would be a fair criticism. It would be a valid criticism. Uh, his philosophy has been called contradictory, and it is true that he consciously avoids building a systematic, logical, philosophical system because such a rational system would have negated or would have contradicted or belied, really, his romantic belief always in the individual's intuition, imagination, and flexibility. You will see this idea being treated and fleshed out when we read Self-Reliance, okay? The British critic Matthew Arnold, 20th century English critic, said that the most important writings in English in all of the 19th century had been William Wordsworth's poems and Emerson's essays. I told you, Emerson's he's a major force. And whether we like him or we dislike him, whether we understand him or whether we are confused by him, we simply we have to come to terms with him. We have to meet him. He's in the middle of the road, and we can't really go around him. His work is that significant. His contributions that important. His contributions, in part, are the influence, or include the influence that his ideas, his life, his writings, and his lectures had on a very long line of American poets, including Walt Whitman, Emily Dickinson, E.A. Robinson, Wallace Stevens, Hart Crane, Robert Frost. He's also credited with influencing the philosophies of John Dewey, an important educational philosopher, William Jage, William James, the father of modern psychology, George Santayana, and Friedrich Nietzsche. It's time to get down to the nitty gritty. Emerson's essay Self-Reliance is published in 1841. For many, it marks the high tide of Emerson's prose, perhaps the one essay that demonstrates why he is so influential. In his essay Self-Reliance, Emerson remarks, a foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds. Yet he is remarkably consistent in his call for the birth of American individualism inspired by nature. got some discussion questions for essay, Emerson's essay, Self-Reliance. You're going to have two options. Option one involves you responding to one of the questions listed here and posting the question and your response in a discussion board post here in Blackboard. You can choose one of these seven. So that's first option. Here's option two, and I think Emerson would like this. And I know Jeff Moore would too. If you don't want to respond to any of the questions that I've posted on the previous slide, here's what you can do. If you would like, choose your own favorite milk dud. Choose the sentence or sentences in Self-Reliance that when you read them, you thought, oh, wow, now he's actually saying something. This is not popcorn anymore. This sentence, this nugget, this idea, this kernel of wisdom and truth and inspiration is meaningful to me. So you can choose your own milk dud, but here's what you need to do. Make sure that in your discussion board post that you write out, quote, the sentence or sentences that constitute your milk dud, and then I want you to explain why you like it, why you are drawn to this particular sentence or sentences. Make sure that you cite the page number of your milk dud too, so that we can all find it as well. Again, I'm really missing you guys. I'm really sad and sorry that we can't be together in class to discuss and experience Emerson together. He's an exciting force. At least I hope you can detect my enthusiasm for Emerson. I hope that you all are well. I hope that your families are all well. I hope that you are taking care of yourselves mentally, physically, and nutritionally. Know that I'm always thinking about you. I hope to see your faces again soon sometime.